This is Garis, Masculist, MGTOW flyers. That is 2 3-page essays on the themes of Masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 271, entitled Feminists' Perceived Monopoly of Gender Issues Makes Them Arrogantly Belligerent. Description. This flyer claims that feminazis are made more belligerent towards men because they believe that gender oppression is a one-way street from men against women. Masculists claim that when feminazis are strongly confronted with masculist ideas, they become more sober, seeing that gender oppression is a two-way street. This flyer gives a list of examples of how women oppress men to enable feminazis to be made more sober. Flyer itself. Feminists' perceived monopoly of gender issues makes them arrogantly belligerent. By Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Most feminists have the view that oppression between the sexes is a one-way street. That is, that it is men who oppress women, who use the patriarchy to keep women down, the inferior sex, to block women rising in the company hierarchy, etc. After half a century of second and third wave feminism, feminists feel justifiably angry at men and feel they have the right to dump on men, belittling them for the crimes that men have committed on women over the centuries. Most of these feminists scoff arrogantly at the ideas coming from the Masculists that gender oppression is not a one-way street, that women can oppress men too. They are quite arrogant and dismissive of this idea. Part of this arrogant dismissal is cognitive dissonance. For most people, it's difficult to give up quickly a deeply entrenched idea. Telling the average feminist that women can severely oppress men too is like going up to a priest and saying, quote, "There's no God, you have wasted your whole life." Of course, the priest is not going to accept such a view, because to do so genuinely would be to collapse his whole self-image, his entire sense of self, of who and what he is. Similarly, with committed feminists who spend their lives fighting for the feminist cause, believing that men are the oppressors, and not giving any credence nor having any patience with the masculist idea that women too can be hateful oppressors. This flyer is aimed at such arrogant feminists who think gender oppression is a one-way street. I will give a list of some of the major arguments that men can use to counter this feminazi arrogance, and not only for men. Non-feminist women, or even more open-minded feminists, can use the items on this list to counter the arrogance of the one-eyed feminazi who is utterly convinced that gender oppression goes in only one direction. It's my experience that once a rabid feminazi has been strongly confronted with masculist arguments, it tends to sober her, make her more measured, less arrogant, more on the one hand, on the other hand, in her view of gender oppression. This sobering is a good thing because men get really sick of feminazi bashing of men as though only men are the oppressors. Absorbing the arguments in the list below will help men to get these feminazis to shut up. Even many women nowadays are thinking that the feminazis have gone too far and have lost sight of reasonableness, have become too extreme, and have left most women behind, who are not prepared to go to the extreme ideological lengths of a one-eyed feminazi. Here are some arguments that men, and some women, can use to counter the views that one-eyed feminazis have regarding the idea that gender oppression is a one-way street committed by men against women. They are used by masculists to show that women can strongly oppress men as well. And I'm ad-libbing now, I give a list, a bulleted list, and we'll then elaborate later, my usual style in these flyers. Bullet. The fluffy parasite manslaver argument. Bullet. The fluffy feminist hypocrite takeover of the divorce courts, financially massacring men. Bullet. Feminazi is cyanide lies about men. Bullet. Feminazi demeaning of men in the media. Bullet. Fluffy resistance against the paternity rejection right. Bullet. Feminazi's child-minded blame of men for all women's problems. Bullet. Feminazi resistance to the rise of MGTOW/masculism. Bullet. Negative female nature, nagging, irrationality, etc. Bullet. Female hypergamy, loving only men's sexploitability. Bullet, etc. Okay, now for the elaboration. Bullet. The fluffy parasite manslaver argument. This is probably the strongest of the Masculists' arguments against women, that is, that women manslave men by sexploiting them to work for women in exchange for sex. Men invented the contraceptive pill, household gadgets, higher education, etc., which liberated women from traditional household drudgery, so that women now have some 4 decades of career window. Masculists point the moral finger at women, saying that, quote, now that women can work, they must work. Anything else is parasitism against men, that is, manslavery. Women have to fip up, become financially independent persons, by getting a career-competent education at high school and university, or be punished by men, by being totally ignored by men, forcing women to rot on the shelf, removing their fluffy genes from the gene pool. The essence of masculism is that it's a rebellion by men against working for women. Masculists tell women, quote, you fip up or you'll be manless. Manslavery is slavery. Slavery arouses passions. Slavery is a war issue, and the Masculists are at war against the fluffies and fluffy feminists, aiming to wipe them out worldwide this century, that is, freeing men from manslavery, from working for women. End quote. Bullet. The fluffy feminist hypocrite takeover of the divorce courts, financially massacring one married father in 4. This is another of the Masculists' strongest arguments, namely that the fluffy feminists and all their awful hypocrisy have taken over control of the divorce courts and are now daily financially massacring and ruining the lives of one married father in 4 by ripping his kids away from him with a 90% probability, forcing him to lose his house, which goes to his fluffy ex-wife for her to raise her kids in, and half of his possessions. Forced to make child payments to kids he will barely see, and if the ex-wife is a real fluffy, he may be forced to pay her alimony for life, with no legal or moral obligation on her to get off her fat parasitic bum and fip up by getting a job, so that she can continue to parasite off him after the divorce the way she did before the divorce. The massive injustice committed in the fluffy feminazi-dominated divorce courts is a major crime against men and cannot continue. Otherwise, men will eventually lose tolerance and take up arms and murder thousands of feminazi divorce court judges and lawyers. The rise of MGTOW, that's men going their own way, is a direct reaction to the toxicity of the fluffy feminist-controlled divorce courts, a major example of women's oppression of men. The Masculists want all women to be socialized and educated to be FIPs, to create a FIP society, so that, amongst other things, the divorce courts can be made men fair, for example, by making custody of the kids joint by default, no alimony, the original owner of the house keeps it, no division of possessions, etc. Women strongly oppress men by not bothering to fip up, by not bothering to get a career-competent education, expecting some manslave to pay for her both before and after the divorce. This fluffy attitude of too many women is truly oppressive against men and has to be wiped out, which is the role of the Masculists. Masculists aim to wipe out manslavery by wiping out fluffies, by ignoring them to extinction, not even pumping and dumping them. Bullet. Feminazi iscyanate lies about men. Feminazis are all too often iscyanate fairies when it comes to discussing men. Iscyanate means ignorant of science, unable to reason scientifically, that is, not having the attitude that it's not enough to have a good theory, one also has to go out into the real world and test that theory. For example, the feminazis keep harping on the idea that we live in a rape culture, that far too many women get raped by men, which is a horrible crime for a woman, to be forcibly penetrated by a man's penis under threat of violence or even death if the man has a knife or a gun. Lately, feminazis have been saying that university campuses are rape cultures, with a rape rate of 1 woman in 5. This is ludicrous and shows a complete inability to think scientifically. If you spend a minute on Google with the question, what is the rape frequency in the US? You'll get the answer of 1.6 rapes per 1,000 adults per year. That is a figure that is about 100 times smaller than the fluffy iscyanate fairy feminazi fiction figure of 1 in 5. Feminazis lie to men about other things, for example, the idea that women are just as capable as men. This is partly true in the sense that the performance score distribution curves for the two sexes overlap a lot, but it's not true at the top end of the performance score distribution curve, which is male dominated. For example, men are smarter than women by 4 IQ points on average. Men have a 10% higher IQ variance than women. So the morons and the genii are males. So it's not surprising that men have won 99% of the science Nobel Prizes. Men have higher testosterone levels than women, so are a lot more aggressive, more ambitious, more dogged, more persistent, and achieve far more than women, who are more wishy-washy and give up more easily. The feminazis complain endlessly about the glass ceiling, that women cannot rise to the top of large organizations due to, supposedly, male resistance and prejudice against women having power, hence the patriarchy. What pisses Masculists off is feminazis rarely admit that women are genetically inferior and handicapped compared to men at the top end of the performance scale. Feminazis let their collective egos get in the way of science, which is something that makes masculist scientists like myself look down on women all the more. The result is that men build cultures and women are largely only tolerated in them by men due to women's two traditional monopolies, namely vagina and womb. But soon male genii will invent the artificial womb and the sex robot, which will cause men to become a lot less tolerant of women's many faults and inferiorities. Women will then go into deep depression as they are forced to come to terms with mass male indifference, as men grow their own kids and prefer to sex their bots that women cannot compete with, given these bots will have film star faces, luscious curvy bodies, and creamy grippy vaginas that more than outcompete women, a third of whom are fat and hence unfuckable, and another third are obese and hence are painful on the eyes. Lately, action heroines have been appearing in Hollywood movies, as though women are as strong and aggressive as men, which is simply farcical. Men are 3 times stronger across the chest than women, so most men could beat women to a pulp quite easily if they wanted to. The Hollywood people are merely catering to young women's narcissistical delusion that they absorbed from the feminazis, that is, the belief that women are as capable as men, even physically. Dash. Bullshit. Bullet. Feminazi demeaning of men in the media. In so many US sitcoms on TV, The husband/father is portrayed as a bumbling fool, as though men are the dumbest members of the family. This negative portrayal of men results from the fact that women have now largely taken over the production of such sitcoms and produce and project their feminazi bias into their shows as a form of supposed revenge for men's crimes against women over the centuries. The reality, of course, is that men are the superior sex with their GMV, greater male variance. That is, men will score higher than women at the top end of the scale on almost any measurable quantity. Men's 4 IQ point higher average IQ and 10% higher IQ variance over women, plus the male testosterone advantage, make men hugely more performant than women, who after all have 10% smaller brains than men. Men invent almost everything, build everything, create everything. Women, on the other hand, have only parasited on men, and for several million years. That is the reality that the broadcast media is not portraying, instead giving young women a false impression of female superiority, turning young women into entitled princesses, insufferably arrogant and strongly disliked by men, because it flies in the face of objective reality. The modern young woman is simply deluded in terms of the sexually dimorphic realities of the world. Bullet. Fluffy resistance against the paternity rejection right. Nearly all women, fluffies and fluffy feminists alike, fight the legislation of the paternity rejection right, tooth and nail. Because if the were to come in, that is, a man would have the legal right to reject an unwanted pregnancy, so that if the woman continues with it, then she gets to bear full legal financial cost of the kid that she wants. A would force women to grow up and behave as fips. With a women could not rely on man-slaves to parasite upon. Women would have to stand on their own financial feet. Masculists are saying to women in this regard, quote, "Hey, femalian, if you want to have a kid, you'll have to pay for it yourself." End quote. Fluffies are terrified of this prospect and want no part of it, so fight the with all their strength. It's terribly threatening to them. No country in the world today has the but it is one of the major goals of the Masculists, to force the gender politicians to legislate the passage of the to give men the equal right to reject an unwanted pregnancy the way that women have, but men don't. This is one of the most blatant examples of sexual discrimination against men and screams of gender injustice. Bullet. Feminazis' child-minded blame of men for all women's problems. Men are utterly fed up with feminazi bitches always putting the blame for women's situation on men, as though women are only children who are incapable of creating their own lives and determining their own fate. Men see feminazis who blame men for everything as child-minded and irresponsible. Men don't respect women for this and tend to look on women as children, who are then not taken seriously and definitely not respected. Adult women, fit women, take responsibility for their own lives and are not dependent on men to solve women's problems for them. Bullet. Feminazi resistance to the rise of MGTOW/Masculism. MGTOWs and Masculists are fed up with the hypocrisy of feminazis who oppose the rise of MGTOW and Masculism. These feminazis are hypocrites because they feel they have the right as feminists to criticize men, but reject the idea that Masculists have a similar right to criticize women. This smacks of inconsistent, sexist hypocrisy. For example, the CEO of YouTube is a Jewish feminazi who is now deleting the YouTube channels of prominent MGTOWs and Masculists. I myself am having the number of my subscribers algorithmically and systematically reduced to lower my hit rate. My voice is going. And hence my Masculist influence on the general public. I've been forced to copy my Masculist videos to other video hosting platforms other than YouTube as a result. This kind of hypocritical opposition only increases Masculist contempt for the feminazis, which is one of the reasons why we label them feminazis in the first place, which is hardly a complimentary label. Bullet. Negative female nature, nagging, irrational, etc. Nearly all men can tell women that women can have very negative natures. Women nag men, which men hate. Women are often irrational, with their 10% smaller brains. Women are more emotional, especially during the PMS, premenstrual syndrome, days of the month, and during menopausal crazy time, when they can become truly hysterical. A nagging woman can make a man's life utterly miserable to the point that he wants out of the relationship, but may then face being financially massacred in the fluffy feminist-controlled divorce courts, so his life is stuck in a cheaper to keep her nagging hell, a miserable half-life. Bullet. Female hypergamy, loving only men's sexploitability. Probably the key idea to come out of the MGTOW movement is that of the red pill, that is, the idea that women don't love men, but rather men's sexploitability. If a man loses his exploitability, his woman will coldly, disloyally dump him in favour of a more exploitable male. Women are always on the lookout for a more exploitable male, a trait of women called hypergamy, that is, monkey branching, that is, letting go of one branch, man, after having grabbed another, newer, better, richer branch, man. Women evolved to be red pill, that is, to love men only for their sexploitability and to monkey branch with men. This tendency of women, although despised by men, makes good Darwinian sense. Women were more likely to be given scarce male hunted meat in the distant past by behaving like this. It is female nature and is not attractive to men at all. One of the Masculist sayings in this regard is, quote, "I'm more than a cash machine, you bitch." Bullet, etc. There are many other examples, but this flyer is already pretty long. The above is a sampling of the many ways in which women can oppress men. Gender oppression is definitely a two-way street, which is something that all people of either sex should know about, as part of their general knowledge. Feminazis, however, don't want this to happen. They want to keep women as being the only victims, because if masculism spreads and spreads, it will inevitably cause women to sober their feminazi hysterics and be forced to be more measured, more balanced in their views on which sex oppresses the other sex. It's a two-way street that Masculists can use to get feminazis to shut up. People of both sexes, when confronted by one-eyed extremist feminazi opinions, can use the above arguments to silence, or at least soften, the force of the arguments of the feminazis. Men need to become more familiar with the above arguments so that they can use them in their daily conversations with women and get women to be more accommodating towards men, especially in the workplace, where all too often women are bullying men based unjustifiably on a false belief that men are to be bullied as revenge for the oppression that men have perpetrated on women for centuries. By being taught masculist ideas, women, particularly feminazis, will be made more sober towards men, and hence will become a lot nicer to be with. If things don't change, then the proportion of men who choose to go MGTOW will only increase, because probably within a decade, 90% of young men will be refusing marriage and paternity, and will thus wipe out the whole population within a mere century. Things have to change. Our very survival as a species is at stake. Feminazis are now genociders who have to be stopped. One way to stop them is to deflate their feminazi egos with masculist pinpricks, with masculist accounts of how women oppress men as well. Cheers. Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Prof. Hugo de Garis at yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. YouTube channels De Garis Masculist MGTOW Flyers and De Garis Essays. Patreon patreon.com/profhugodegaris. minds.com/profhugodegaris. Ciao.